Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today. I hope you can all hear me okay. Let me know if you can't. My name is Serena Black, and I work with the University of Northern BC as the Agriculture Extension Specialist, and I am the chair of the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, or BC ACARN. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the UBC's Vancouver campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I would also like to acknowledge that you are all joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. I myself am joining in from Prince George, which is the unceded territory of the Lheidli T'enneh. Today is our third installment of the webinar series, Building a Resilient Food System During COVID-19 and Beyond. This webinar series will feature many of the foremost food system experts from UBC and across British Columbia. This webinar is brought to you by the Centre for Sustainable Food Systems, the BC Food Web, and the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, and I'm going to take just a brief moment to introduce our hosts. The Centre for Sustainable Food Systems at the UBC Farm is a teaching and research centre, as well as a local to global food hub, working towards a more sustainable, food secure future. Their mission is to innovate from field to fork and to achieve resilient, thriving, and socially just food systems for all. The BC Food Web is a web portal project which aims to increase access and connection to current research and other resource materials. In addition, it aims to encourage innovation between farmers and researchers for future project collaborations and increase the amount of community-based research. The Faculty of Land and Food Systems is a world leader in integrated research and education and service. The faculty aims to address critical global issues around human health and sustainable food supply. As I mentioned, our webinar topic today is a food system in crisis, climate change, COVID-19, and opportunities for change. And we are joined here today by Dr. Sean Smukler, Dr. Kent Mullenix, and Dr. Kirsten Hannum, who will each discuss their research and perspectives on preparing and strengthening the BC agriculture for food system resilience and climate change adaptation. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. After each presenter gives their presentation, we will then move on to a Q&A portion of today's webinar. So at any time, if you have questions that you would like to be answered ahead of time, there is a Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel. So please utilize that feature and feel free to upvote other people's questions if you think it's a particularly important one to ask. Lastly, I would also like to acknowledge that these are unprecedented times, which means we all have new working conditions. So please don't mind us if there are any distractions or interruptions, although we don't anticipate any of those today. Before we begin, I do want to take just 2 or 3 minutes to provide a bit of context and background to the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network, ACARN, which is the organization that has linked each of our panelists and brought them to the discussion here today. So BC ACARN is a network that formed about 4 years ago in response to the need to increase collaboration across institutions and across disciplines in order to address the challenges associated with climate adaptation in agriculture. What makes the network unique is that it's bringing together government, academia, and industry. Our steering committee includes representation from 10 institutions, and we have 119 members from 39 different organizations. Climate change is creating complex problems, and it requires complex solutions that therefore require diverse perspectives and a transdisciplinary approach. There are many people working towards a common goal, and ACARN is working to strengthen the ties between these people doing this important work. So what does BC ACARN do? There's several things. We do promote sharing of information and resources. We do this a variety of different ways, which include hosting both annual provincial and regional workshops, coordinating different webinar series, and regular member updates. We also coordinate provincial network projects that will help build these diverse, inclusive teams to start addressing these problems. Network projects cover all disciplines with diverse teams collaborating to find these solutions. We also partner with the BC Climate Action Initiative to help communicate research findings to producers themselves and develop extension materials to make sure that the research is getting in the hands of farmers and hopefully implemented out in the fields. And finally, we are also looking forward to training the next generation of researchers and extension specialists across the province in order to continue building this network into the future. At any time, if you'd like to learn more, I do encourage you to visit our website or reach out to us directly. ACARN has opened the door to start building meaningful discussions on these complex issues, which is why I'm so excited to be able to hear from each of our panelists today who have been so instrumental in building ACARN as a network as well. So let's jump right in. We're going to start today with Dr. Kent Mullenix. Dr. Kent Mullenix is the director of the Institute for Sustainable Food Systems at the Kwantlen Polytechnic University. His research and extension work focuses on ecologically sound crop production, agriculture education programming, sustainable bioregional food systems as a foundational and integral element of a sustainable society. Dr. Mullenix is an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Land and Food Systems at the University of British Columbia and serves on the leadership team and editorial board of the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. So with that, I'll pass it off to you, Dr. Mullenix.
Thank you, Serena. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning, or today, or morning, afternoon. To me, the lessons of COVID and the experience that we are all involved in right now really come down to the sustainability of our food system. Next, please. Food system sustainability is the foundation of human sustainability. We must bring forth a sustainable food system to facilitate a resilient future. Next, please. That implies that our food system must be environmentally sound, economically sound, and socially just and equitable. It also implies that our system must be resilient. It must have the capacity to adjust to and quickly recover from perturbance or shocks. And resilience is derived from being adaptable. And adaptability is a function of diversity and the ability to quickly reorganize. Next, please. So I want to take a few minutes and quickly examine some significant sustainability challenges in our dominant food system paradigm. Next, please. First, we need to recognize that two requisite resources for food production, land and water, are essentially maxed out. We use about 70% of the world's fresh water for agriculture, and there simply isn't any more. Likewise, we are farming, for all practical purposes, all of the land there is to be farmed. And simply put, more is not being created. Next, please. We also are obligated to recognize that our dominant food system is utterly dependent on non-renewable resource, namely fossil fuels. And this dependence has rendered our food system inefficient in terms of energy conversion. The average energy return on energy invested, the investment is oil and fossil fuels, is about 1.5, and for ground beef, it's about 1 to 50. And before the wholesale industrialization of agriculture, the energy return on energy investment was positive. So somehow, through the industrialization of agriculture, we have turned that eloquent relationship between green plants, the sun, and us obtaining energy on its head. Next, please. Further, increasingly, agriculture is not profitable for primary producers. While gross farm receipts continue to increase, net farm receipts in Canada, as in most industrial agriculture jurisdictions, have been flat since the very inception of the industrialization of the food system. So farmers are not benefiting from the economic growth associated with our food system. Next, please. Additionally, despite the fact that we are producing more food globally than ever before, in fact, enough to feed every person on Earth over 3,000 calories per day, we find that approximately a third of the world's population is food insecure, while another third of the population eats too much and suffers from what we call the suite of Western diseases associated with diet. And in fact, in major agricultural nations, food insecurity is prevalent. Over 9% of Canadians are food insecure, for example. Next, please. But the gorilla in the room in terms of food system, agriculture and food system sustainability is global climate change. We need to recognize that agriculture developed over 11,000 years under a regime of very constant climate and weather patterns, and in places where the soils developed over millennia to support crop production. And all of that is changing, and changing in ways that we are challenged to predict. It was estimated that the upper safe limit of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere was 350 parts per million. We're now at 415 parts per million approximately. And for every increase in temperature, there is going to be a Celsius, a decrease in staple crop production. We've already experienced since the 1980s nearly a 1 degree Celsius increase and in global temperature. And we who live in higher latitudes are going to feel the effects of climate change and global warming even more. Next, please. With it's estimated that if CO2 levels reach 450 parts per million, which we seem on the trajectory to do, that temperatures on average will increase by about 6 degrees centigrade by the end of the 21st century. And if that happens, it is predicted that the world will face irreversible Dust Bowl-like conditions. And I think we can expect, if this occurs, for many of the major production areas of the world to not be engaged in agriculture. Next, please. The real travesty in this is that agriculture and our food system is contributing to its own demise. Agriculture is estimated to contribute about 10 to 15% of all anthropogenic greenhouse gases, and the food system on the whole, approximately 35% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. And somehow the agriculture sector seems reluctant to engage in mitigation, just like other sectors of our economy. But we need to know that while adaptation is absolutely critical, mitigation is easier and mitigation is cheaper, and we need to do both simultaneously. Next, please. Undoubtedly, climate change and its impacts is going to exacerbate the sustainability of the global industrial food system. We can count on that. And we have gotten a taste of that, of the potential from the pandemic. Next, please. So some of the things that we have seen, folks who are paying attention have seen from the pandemic in terms of impacting the dominant transnational food system include nations retreating from that system. They have placed national food interests first, curtailed exports. We've seen that with concentrated elements of the food system, when they cease to function, it disrupts the entire supply chain, and they are vulnerable to disruption. We are concerned with system dependence on temporary foreign workers, and when we bring them in the midst of the pandemic, when we bring them into work on farms and into work in food system environments, we are endangering them. We have absolutely seen supply chains fail, and when links fail, there's been waste and shortages. We have seen the economic status of farmers and ranchers suffer further from the pandemic. We've also have seen marginalized populations are more vulnerable to the impacts of supply chain disruptions. And generally, we've seen a lack of adaptability and nimbleness in this food system. Next, please. Anecdotally, we have observed in BC that smaller scale community focused farmers have responded quickly and nimbly, and they've expanded production and are feeding more families. And suppliers to them have also responded. We've also seen that people have responded. They have adapted procurement, alternate procurement means. They've also changed their eating habits. Baking has surged in BC. Both are exemplars of resilience in the face of system shock. Next, please. We've conducted a survey in British Columbia to assess the impact of the pandemic on citizens. So far, we have 1,600 respondents, and it indicates that lower income groups are finding it much more difficult to access food in the pandemic. Wealthier households and individuals do not notice food prices as much. 11% of the respondents have increased online food shopping. 42% of respondents report eating more junk food and having difficulty accessing fresh fruits and vegetables. 30% of respondents worry about food insecurity. This pandemic continue. 61% expressed concern about the reliability of the global food system, and 87% of respondents want government to support building and strengthening local regional food systems. Next, please. If you want to participate in this, the links for 8 Canadian provinces can be found at this website. Next, please. So the climate change is likely to result in shock after shock to the global industrial food system. In fact, there may be, we might describe it as a death by 1,000 cuts. Next, please. And the question then is, and farmers and everyday people will bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change in the food system. And that begs the question, what kind of agriculture and food system will offer the greatest opportunity for mitigation, the greatest opportunity for adaptation and resilience? And I would suggest that the answer should not be driven by transnational food or fossil fuel interests. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kent. Perfect. So we're going to quickly move on to make sure we have time for questions. So up next, we have Dr. Kirsten Hannum, who is an agroecologist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Summerlin, BC. Kirsten and her team aim to enhance the resilience of the BC tree fruit sector through effective and efficient soil, nutrient, and water management practices. In previous lives, she has worked as a soil scientist with the BC Ministry of Forests and as a policy analyst with Natural Resources Canada. So, Dr. Hannah.
Thanks, Serena. Can everyone hear me okay and see my screen all right? Great. First, I want to thank you for inviting me today and thank Kent for laying the groundwork for my talk. I'd like today to talk a little bit about climate-related drivers of food insecurity in British Columbia. And then I'm going to touch on a few factors that are leading to an increasing demand for irrigation water in the province. Then I'll close by talking a little bit about some of the things we are and can do to address possible future droughts and growing uncertainty in the agricultural sector. All the way back in 2006, the province of BC released a report examining the effects of population growth and changes in eating habits on BC's food self-reliance. And the report concluded by saying that we need to increase the amount of food production generated in BC and also expand access to irrigated land. Since that report was released, climate change has increased the frequency and number of extreme weather events that have threatened the supply of food all across the globe. This has had particular importance for us in terms of how food production in the United States has been influenced. The United States produces a lot of the fruits and vegetables that BC consumes, and it has led to numerous concerns about the accessibility of food coming from the United States and the cost to consumers. Now, with this new coronavirus pandemic, we only are seeing greater and greater concern about cracks in the global food system and how they're going to affect food quality and food access. It's leading to greater calls and increased urgency from within the province to make sure that we have a resilient food system that can, as much as possible, produce BC food for BC people. So at the same time that climate change is affecting extreme events that influence our global neighbors and their ability to produce food, we're also seeing the effects of climate change within the province. For example, BC is getting a lot warmer. The two panels that you see at the bottom of the slide show average summer temperatures for 2 periods. The panel on the left is historic average summer temperatures from 1961 to 1990. And the panel on the right shows average summer temperatures from 2010 and projected up to 2039. You can see that the panel on the right is colored much darker, indicating that summers are getting hotter in BC. This has important implications for the amount of irrigation water we need to grow our crops. As temperatures increase, the amount of water lost from the soil surface to evaporation also increases, as does the amount of water lost through plant stomates via transpiration. When evapotranspiration increases, the need for irrigation water also increases. But warming temperatures also influence what we can grow and where. The 3 panels that you see on this slide show the results of a modeling exercise we've been doing looking at sweet cherry as an indicator crop for changing crop suitability across the landscape in response to climate change. We used the CANI-SM2 model under RCP 8.5 and generated 50 realizations or 50 possible future climates up to 2050. And we used these 50 future climates and ran them through a crop suitability model for sweet cherry to help us understand how sweet cherry, how the area and the timing of sweet cherry cultivation may change through time. So you can see the panel on the very left is largely colored in red. And this is showing the expected area that sweet cherry could have been cultivated in the 1950s. And you can see, given that it's red, that very little of the Okanagan Valley could support a sweet cherry industry in the past. But as we move through the 2000s to the 2050s, you can see that this map of the Okanagan Valley gets increasingly color green, indicating that more and more of the landscape is expected to be able to support a very cold sensitive crop of sweet cherry into the future. And we're already seeing changes in what crops can be grown and where across the landscape. Within the Okanagan Valley itself, we've seen orchards that are being planted higher up in elevation and higher up in latitude than would have been considered possible even a few decades ago. And a lot of this land was formerly used as unirrigated rangeland. Now that this land is in some cases being converted to orchards, we need to start to think about how to make sure that those orchards can be reliably irrigated. The figure that you see on this side was generated by my colleague Denise Nielsen and her collaborators. They used 5 CMIT 5 global climate models in combination with the BC's water demand model to try and understand how warmer temperatures caused by climate change and expanded agriculture into other areas of the agriculture land reserve, as well as expansion of irrigated agriculture, would affect how much water is required across or will be required across 17 agricultural regions in the province. And then you can see here that some regions, such as the Fraser Valley, the North and Central Okanagan, and the Thompson and Nicola Valleys, may experience quite significant increases in irrigation water demand in the future under a warmer climate and expanded agricultural land. Oops. So what can we do about it? One of the first important steps was recently taken by the province of BC, who passed the Water Sustainability Act in 2016. Prior to passage of this act, irrigation water drawn from surface water, such as streams and lakes, required a license. But irrigation drawn from groundwater, so drawn from wells, did not require a license. Now, both non-domestic use of both surface water and groundwater requires a license. And this is a great tool because it allows the province to better understand where water is being used in the province, when and how much, and also try to anticipate where water might be available for future crops. The Water Sustainability Act also allows for the development of water sustainability plans for a given watershed or region. And these sustainability plans can include an agricultural water reserve, which is a set volume of water that is preserved for agricultural use. So it could turn out to be a really key tool. Another thing that we can do within the province is adopt more efficient irrigation practices. Back in 2006, a land use survey was conducted for the Okanagan Valley, which found that woody perennial horticultural crops, about approximately 40% of woody perennial horticultural crops were being grown using highly efficient micro irrigation practices. When the land use survey was reproduced 8 years later, almost 30% more growers were using efficient irrigation water practices, which is really encouraging. So now water is applied in a more efficient way, which means that less is lost to evaporation. One of the critical next steps is to help growers make sure that they only apply what irrigation water is needed. So we want to encourage growers to apply water to replace only that which is lost to evapotranspiration. And there are tools such as the online FarmWest tool that can be used to help growers estimate how much their crop has lost to evapotranspiration so that they know how much irrigation water needs to be applied. And this can help reduce waste. There are also a lot of other on-farm practices that can be adopted, and I'll just show a couple little examples here. We can use surface mulches, for example, which reduce the amount of water that is lost from the soil surface. These data are taken from a young Merlot vineyard that is planted at the Summerland Research and Development Center, and it shows differences in soil moisture content between bare soils and soils that have a surface mulch of wood and bark chips. And you can see that the mulch not only lowers the soil surface temperatures, but helps those soils retain soil moisture for longer. Another example of a promising tool is post-harvest deficit irrigation in sweet cherry orchards. This work was done by Louise Nelson and her master's student Tirhis Gebretsadakan, and they found that a 25% reduction in irrigation water applications after harvest had no negative effects on the fruit quality and yield the subsequent year. And the results of that study are so promising that they're following up with a further study looking at even more extreme irrigation water deficits after harvest. So I want to conclude by reminding you that there are a lot of threats to our food security. Kent reviewed several of them, and the COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated these stresses. Climate change is going to cause a big increase in demands for irrigation water, which is one of the factors we really need to manage carefully if we want to have a resilient food system. Longer, warmer growing seasons, potentially expanded irrigation areas, and concerns about the water supply and its reliability really need to be addressed. But there are critical steps that have been taken, and there are a lot of additional tools that we're starting to identify that can be used to make sure we use our water effectively and efficiently.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kirsten. Really enjoyed that. And before we jump into our last presenter, I do just want to remind everybody that as you come up with questions, please enter them into the Q&A, as we are hoping to have a fair amount of time after our presentations to address at least a handful of them. And with that, I'm happy to be introducing Dr. Sean Smukler. Dr. Sean Smukler's research program is focused on working with farmers, other managers of agricultural landscapes to find ways to better monitor, protect, and enhance biodiversity and the availability of ecosystem services, including food, fiber, fuel, and timber production, greenhouse gas mitigation, and water quality and quantity regulation. He and his Sustainable Agriculture Landscape Lab are also currently working with CSFS at the UBC Farm to better understand the nutrient dynamics of various local amendment options for organic production systems. That, Dr. Smukler.
Great, thanks, Serena. Thanks, Kent and Kirsten for great setup. I really appreciate that. So I'm gonna talk about how we take some of the lessons we've learned to enhance the resilience at the farm level. So I think what the COVID situation is really identified for all of us is how fragile the system is, the food system is overall, and really the various points all along the food value chain, from the farm all the way to the fork, that need shoring up. But I would argue that this really actually, it starts at the farm. Some of the effects of COVID have been, they've made clear these vulnerabilities at the farm level. We've seen consumers shift their preferences. And, we've seen these reports as French fries are no longer being produced. Potato farmers are feeding their potatoes to cattle or destroying them. Or as consumers can't get their lattes, now we've got this excess amount of milk. And then, as Kent mentioned, the situation with our migrant labor force. So these are all really important events that have shown us that we need to work on our resilience. So the COVID crisis, in some ways, is really opportune in that we now see some of the impacts to our food system that many of us have been talking about for many, many years. Impacts that climate change is promising to have on the system that is so vulnerable. Problem with climate change is that it's happening slowly. This graph from the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium is showing just how slowly the temperature is expected to change in the province, and that we see it accelerate only in the decades following the 2030s. But we know climate change is happening now. We've seen some of the impacts, and some of the projections, as Kent and Kirsten pointed out, are going to be really challenging for our farmers. At the same time, there are opportunities. The PKIC modeling from their climate ensembles or climate model ensembles are showing that temperatures here in the Fraser Valley, where UBC is located, are expected to increase. And this might be good news for farmers in our region. At the same time, this might bring in additional pests that we haven't seen in the past, both disease and insect pests. And as Kirsten pointed out, this means that the increased temperatures require potentially more irrigation. And projections are showing that precipitation is likely to decrease. But most importantly, the precipitation as snow is likely to decrease. And that's where we store our water for irrigation during the summertime. We're also expecting to see shifting precipitation patterns. That means that farmers are going to have a harder time getting in on their fields in the spring when they need to prepare the crop, and in the fall without damaging their soil. And just as the farm is the place where we really need to start with resilience, I would argue that the soil is really the basis for building that resilience. So soils are key to any production, and soils are important for resilience in that they help store water, they help cycle nutrients, and they help to resist disease. Overall, help to build a healthy crop. We had a crisis before in agriculture. We had this in the 1930s, where for 10 years we had a drought that affected the prairies all across North America, and millions of tons of soil were moved from one place to another. And we learned some incredible lessons from that. We mobilized, that crisis created action. We helped change farmers' practices. We developed science on how we conserve soils. And now our prairies are doing well. They're highly productive. They're conserving soil. And I would say that we potentially gained a lot from that crisis. Unfortunately, I don't know whether we have forgotten those lessons, or we need another acute crisis to remind us. But so this map is showing soil organic carbon in the lower Fraser Valley as modeled by a PhD student who just graduated in my lab, Siddharth Paul. And what this is showing, that from 1984 to 2018, we are losing soil organic carbon. Soil organic carbon is a key indicator of soil health. Across the valley in this region, 61% of our farms were in decline for soil organic carbon, with only 12% increasing. And I blame this on the slow pace of change. And this is what makes climate change so insipid. It's so hard to see the changes. So thankfully, we have the Climate Action Initiative, who is really taking an enormous lead in the province to develop strategies to deal with climate change, meeting with farmers and scientists, really pushing forward adaptation strategies. One of their programs, the Farm Adaptation Innovator Program, is doing that on farm. And we've worked with that funded through that program. So a couple examples of the projects that we've done on farm. So we've evaluated different drainage practices that farmers can use to enhance their their workability of their soils. We showed that if farmers invest in this expensive drainage systems, they can substantially enhance the duration of their workability of the season, and that this investment over time is going to pay off as the climate begins to change. Another project that we've been working on now with funding from FAPE is to look at different wintertime soil covers to deal with this too much or too little water situation. So we're looking at winter cover crops and comparing them to silage tarps in organic vegetable production. And this is new data that we just produced, and is showing really interesting differences between these two strategies for dealing with water. And another example of a federally funded project from the Agricultural Greenhouse Gas Program, we're trying to develop strategies for reducing emissions. As Kent pointed out, mitigation is probably what we need to be focused on immediately. So we've identified that there are strategies in organic production systems to substantially reduce the emissions. So building a resilient farm really is a shared challenge. We as scientists need to work directly with farmers. Consumers need to understand the situation that farmers are in. Policymakers need to understand what the science is saying and how to promote it. And a clear example from our neighbors in the south of how this might be done is the California Healthy Soils Initiative, where they're committing $15 million a year to enhance the health of soils across the region. And I would argue that the BC Agricultural Climate Adaptation Research Network is a way that we can continue to do that here. So as Serena pointed out, we're a transdisciplinary approach to building collaborative research across the province. So I'm going to leave you with 3 ideas of how to build farm resiliency. We need to be able to improve farmer access to information. So this is not only producing actionable science, but also engaging farmers so that we're transferring knowledge from farmer to farmer, farmer to scientist, scientist to farmer. And we need to enhance programs that can support farm investments, these expensive drainage programs or drainage infrastructure. And finally, as pointed out by Kent and Serena, we need to support our local farms to really build the local farm economy. And I guess we'll open it up for questions. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you so much, Sean. And I think at this point, I'll ask all of our panelists to join back in with their video. And we're going to jump into the questions. We have about 15 minutes to dive in. So the first question we have, and it's nice and it links partially how Sean finished his presentation, is that are Indigenous governments included in BC ACARN? So we are working on building our partnerships and being representative. So how are we including the Indigenous governments within our network? As the chair, I'll give a brief answer and then encourage any of our, because each of our panelists are also members, so I'd really like to hear from you as well. Is that we, in our steering committee, we do not have an official Indigenous government represented in the steering committee. But knowing each of the institutions and organizations that we work with, I know a lot of them do work really closely with the Indigenous communities throughout our province. But I do recognize that there's ways and conversations that we should be having to make sure that those are being included. So with that quick response, is there any additional comments that you guys would like to provide on that? There's a second part to the question as well.
Well, I would just encourage it, folks who are from those Indigenous communities, if they're with us now, to join us. I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll just mention as well that Agriculture Canada has recognized that has been a distinct lack of engagement with Indigenous communities and Agriculture Canada, and there is a specific program now to cultivate those relationships, but it's shockingly new initiative, so it's starting to be recognized.
In the Institute, one of our major programmatic thrusts is engagement with Indigenous communities and governments. And our what we endeavor to do is support the nations and communities achieving their food system aspirations. And so we provide a lot of technical support and facilitations and education support. Our Tsawwassen First Nation Farm School is the quintessential example of our efforts to support the nations and Indigenous communities to achieve their food system aspirations. And we're learning a lot from our engagement with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thank you for that response. And I think it leads into a more in-depth question that we've received, which is so the centering of colonial agricultural systems, and at least, and throughout our webinar and everybody who's been speaking and the content being offered in this comment is completely erasing Indigenous foodways and knowledge and their role in the past and future stewards of adaptive food systems. And so the question is, how are we justifying not centering the Indigenous work and presence into our conversations here today? Important, deep question.
I think we have to learn how to do better, but yeah, it's questions like these that make us think about those things, and we just have to force ourselves to think and learn, talk to each other.
We do have to learn, and Indigenous perspective and Indigenous foodways must figure, and Indigenous food sovereignty must figure centrally in our advancement of sustainable food systems. There is no other way. To do otherwise is to extend a mentality of colonialism. But we're challenged to understand how to go about that, and it will take extensive interaction, extensive engagement, and extensive understanding, and it will require us to we settler descendants to learn to think and be in very different ways. And I think in my experience, there are a lot of us in the sustainable food system movement that embrace that challenge and are working to embrace it. We do need to acknowledge, I think, as absolutely critical, immediately critical in Indigenous sovereignty is, we also have a crisis to deal with in climate change and figuring out how to feed 8 billion people without destroying Mother Earth. And it's a very serious challenge.
Yeah, it is.
And we need to listen and learn from Indigenous communities and persons, and especially, I think, in terms of our relationship with the earth and each other and and all of creation.
Yeah, what really resonates with me is just the diversity that we see in our province. And it's so rich, and there's so much that we can learn. And I think my response is that I would really like to see more opportunities for this engagement and to learn about these systems, and and really encourage people to follow up with us with dialogue and resources so we can continue to have this conversation moving forward, because there is just so much to learn. And with that, another question that we had, and I think a question that a lot of us think to ourselves on a regular basis, is that as consumers, what actions can we be taking to help increase the resilience of our food systems, both local and global, and thinking about short-term and long-term in terms of effects of climate change? What can consumers be looking at doing to help build towards a resilient future?
Yeah, I think the first step is really to understand your food system, and to start supporting your local farmers. I think one of the challenges with our current global system is that we don't have much control over, or much influence over, the way the food that we eat is being produced. So, we mainly eat vegetables from California here, and we don't have any impact on the California farmers, except for a few choices, whether we buy organic or conventional from California. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And if we know our farmers, if we know our food system, the choices that we make when we go to vote, when we go to select where or what type of food that we eat, are much more likely to have impact.
Any additional thoughts, Kent or Kirsten?
I think Sean made great points. We need to buy local as much as possible. Make sure our farmers can make a decent living.
I might add that I think we need to dispel the notion that regenerative or organic or agriculture cannot feed the world. It can, and we simply need to advance it. We need to do more research, and we need to disseminate more knowledge to primary producers, and we need to set up the systems that support that kind of agriculture and food system. But we can absolutely feed the world without compromising future generations' ability to feed the world. And we can enhance our environment, increase biodiversity, increase ecological function, increase our health and happiness, I believe, in doing so.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I think when we look at making steps in the right direction and how do we support this, I think one thing that perhaps has come out of the COVID-19 pandemic is really showcasing, as you guys have said, the vulnerabilities of our food system. So where do we see opportunities, both provincially and across the country, to perhaps increase the urgency in which we start to address these gaps? COVID-19 kind of highlighted them, but it really potentially is showcasing what this could look like in response to climate change.
Just a thought. One of the things that I'm very concerned with is that the pandemic will be used as an excuse or a rationale to further industrialize and globalize the food system, and I think that is the antithesis of the way we need to be thinking. But but we are enamored with this idea that creating wealth will solve our sustainability challenges, and it will not. It has not. A realignment of our economic goals and our relationship with each other and with the earth through our food system is really what we need to think about.
Fantastic. And Kirsten or Sean?
Well, I do think food security is top of mind for a lot of provincial and federal government agencies these days. And so anything we can do to keep it there as the pandemic continually shifts our priorities and our attention is really key. Right now, I think the federal government is probably just trying to get a handle on things, but you do see them starting to think about what to do about migrant worker health issues, of course, and how to deal with surpluses in how to make sure that food banks get the food that they need, and why do we need so many food banks? So all of these things are right at the top of mind right now with government agencies, and whatever we can do to make sure that as our attention fades to other things, we don't lose that attention, because right now they're paying attention.
And I would just add that I think this is, although this seems like an acute crisis right now, I imagine that we're going to be feeling the ramifications throughout the food system for years to come. And as we saw with the financial crisis of 2008, which affected farmers and food systems around the world, those impacts were felt for many years. And yet we didn't change much. And so, hopefully this is the straw that breaks the camel's back, that we do learn some lessons, and that as this wears on, as the crisis unfolds over the next couple of years and has these ramifications, we look for ways. And I would love to be able to point out details of ways we could change the system, but we just have a couple of minutes right now. But we really do need to, as Kirsten said, let's keep this conversation going, keep this at the front of people's minds, in front of our politicians' minds. We got to take advantage of this situation and make sure that this is the last time this happens to our system.
I think that's a really good point. We are seeing literally billions upon billions of dollars being poured into the food system to keep it afloat, and we're going to see over the next few years as the impacts of the pandemic continue, as Sean just alluded to, billions and billions more go into for economic recovery in the food system. And I really think that we as citizens need to challenge our leadership in terms of what economic recovery in the food system looks like, and what does it achieve for advancing our sustainable food system future. I'm hopeful that those billions upon billions of dollars don't just go to recreating the system that we know can't persist.
Yes, I think it's such a pertinent topic, and I'm really excited that we had the opportunity to gather and start this discussion. And there's several questions that I was going to try to fit in, but we are officially at 4 o'clock. So instead of asking one last question, I would encourage you each to maybe give us 15, 20 second take home message for us here today. I don't know if we want to how we want to start.
Sure. I mean, I would like to end on a hopeful note. I do see this as painful as the crisis is. I do see that it also is an important opportunity for us to mobilize. I'm hopeful. I hope you are too.
Not to sound boring, but I'm going to echo Sean that before this pandemic occurred, we were really seeing a lot more interest in, investment in, and concern about the effects of climate change on food systems in our country. And I hope that we can leverage some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic to continue to push that work forward.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. I'm actually more hopeful than I've been in a long, long time. The pandemic and the social movements that we're seeing are all coming together to empower people, to encourage and facilitate the change that we need. So I think we're at the time now where we should be increasingly optimistic and increasingly encouraged to all join forces, join hands, and really make this transition a reality.
Well, yeah, thank you guys for helping us to end on a hopeful note. And I do, in my personal experience, I find when we're going through change is often when I feel the most uncomfortable, which I think over the last few months we've all been feeling that uncomfort, but I do think we're moving towards some meaningful change in these discussions. And I know there was many unanswered questions, and we will try to answer these questions after today's webinar, and more information about where to find this follow-up dialogue will come to a follow-up email. So really a sincere thank you to our presenters, Sean Smukler, Kirsten Hannum, and Kent Mullenix. You guys did a phenomenal job leading our discussion here today, and I really appreciate it. And behind the scenes, we've had a lot of support, so I'd also like to thank Melanie Kuxdorf, Jessica Lattis, Mairead Norton, and Anisha Sandhu for giving me all the tech support and getting us through today. And I hope that you guys do join us in 2 weeks for our 4th episode titled The Role of Innovation in Building a More Food Secured Future, happening on July 9th at 3 p.m. And let us know what you thought about our webinar. We will be sending you out a short survey about this session tomorrow, and you can always visit us at ubcfarm.ubc.ca. So again, thank you all for joining in, and we look forward to continuing this discussion. See you later.